At 25,000 feet above northern Germany, the sky looked clean enough to breathe, yet the crews of the 8th Air Force knew it was thick with steel. Black blossoms of flak sprouted among the silver-grey contrails as the 384th Bomb Group droned toward Bremen. Each fortress in the box formation trembled to the rhythm of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, their propeller arcs blurring into pale halos in the high sun. In the lead element, the pilots of Hell's Kitchen, Mary Jane, and Ruthless Angel checked oxygen flows and watched the black puffs walk nearer. To the gunners, it seemed as if the bursts were searching, feeling for altitude, closing range one invisible step at a time. The Germans below were professionals, veterans of thousands of interceptions. Their flak predictors fed data from radar and rangefinders into analog computers that spat out elevation and fuse time faster than any man could calculate. Once the rhythm was found, the air filled with timed explosions precisely where the bombers would be, not where they were. Inside Ruthless Angel, Waist Gunner Sergeant Tom Murray counted the seconds between bursts. He noticed something strange. The aircraft on their right, Sweet Laverne, seemed to vanish earlier into the haze, its tail melting away long before its wings did. He blinked behind his goggles. The vertical stabilizer looked darker, almost forest green rather than olive drab. When a flak burst erupted almost directly beneath it, the glare swallowed the whole tail. When the smoke cleared, Sweet Laverne was still flying, untouched. Down below, gunners along the Weser River cheered as the sky filled with smoke and fragments. Their commanders logged another treffer, a probable hit, but the black shapes above kept their course, steady and implacable. On the ground, the differences among bombers were invisible. On gun cameras, they were lost in monochrome haze. Only the men in the air saw how a few fortresses looked oddly patched, their tails painted in a darker hue. Over the target, the lead bombardier toggled the switch at the flash of the red signal light. Bomb bay doors yawned open. 10,000 pounds of high explosive tumbled free. The formation staggered as weight dropped away, then turned for home, engines labouring through a ceiling of shrapnel and smoke. Flak bursts followed them out like angry bees. When they landed that afternoon at Grafton Underwood, the ground crews counted holes and patched skin with speed tape. Mary Jane had a wheel shot away on approach. Hell's Kitchen came in on 2 engines. Sweet Laverne, the ship with the strange green tail, had 1 neat puncture in a flap and not a single hit on the fuselage. During debrief in the Nissen hut, the intelligence officer recorded every detail, while steam from tin mugs of coffee mingled with cigarette smoke. Sergeant Murray was still talking about the tail. Looked darker than the rest, he said. When the bursts came close, she just disappeared. Like Jerry couldn't get a fix on her. Lieutenant Joe Riker, the navigator, nodded. In that thin haze, it blended right in. I lost sight of her completely a couple of times. The pilot, Captain Hal Carter, grinned wearily. Maybe the Krauts rangefinders couldn't see that colour. Next time, paint us all like that. The intelligence man chuckled and moved on, marking the report routine. But in the days that followed, crews kept mentioning those odd tails. No one could say exactly when the darker panels had begun appearing on fortresses of the 384th. Some said it was a field repair job using whatever paint was at hand. Others blamed a stateside subcontractor. Whatever the cause, the darker centre of the vertical stabilizer gave the aircraft a shadowed look as if the sky itself had claimed part of the machine. In the ready room, a superstition took root. Fly behind the dark-tailed ones, gunners said. They draw the luck. Pilots half believed it, though they joked that the enemy simply preferred better painted targets. The maintenance officers had no explanation. Boeing's manuals specified olive drab number 41 with neutral grey undersurfaces. Yet when the depot at Burtonwood received new tail assemblies, their paperwork listed medium green number 42 for the centre panel, an old camouflage shade intended for ground equipment, not aircraft. Somewhere in America, perhaps in a hurry on a midnight shift, a clerk or painter had grabbed the wrong drum. Production could not stop for a colour discrepancy. The parts were crated, shipped by rail to Seattle, then by convoy to England, and riveted onto airframes bound for combat. By the time anyone noticed, dozens of bombers carried the accidental paint. In an air war where every percentage point of survival mattered, that single oversight would ripple outward in ways no one in the paint shop could imagine. Back in the air, Sweet Laverne flew 4 more missions in April and May. Each time she returned with minimal damage. Her crew joked that the Germans still hadn't found the right shade on their rangefinders. On the 13th of May, when flak over keel took down 7 fortresses in her squadron, she came home again, oil-streaked but intact. The operations officer, reviewing mission photos, noticed the pattern. "Those green-tailed ships again," he murmured. The air war over Europe was arithmetic in blood. A bomber crew faced odds so precise they could be graphed. 1 chance in 20 of finishing 25 missions alive. Statisticians in the 8th Air Force headquarters at High Wycombe calculated loss probabilities down to tenths of a percent. A 2% improvement in survivability meant thousands of men over the course of a campaign. Anything armor layout, formation spacing, or even paint that nudged the numbers mattered. At night, while crews wrote letters or played cards, the sound of maintenance hammers echoed across the hardstands. Men worked by hooded lamps, patching flak holes with dull aluminum. The darker tails gleamed faintly even under blackout rules, absorbing light instead of reflecting it. Some ground men speculated that the green pigment contained a different binder, less reflective under searchlights. They didn't know that medium green 42 had been designed precisely for matte diffusion in humid climates, an accident of chemistry now serving a purpose 3,000 miles from its original intent. By midsummer, more aircraft with the peculiar tail finish arrived. The color variation became less remarkable, lost among the patched panels and replacement parts of a hard-worked fleet. Yet the idea lingered. Somewhere in a notebook at 8 Bomber Command, an officer recorded a passing comment. Possible visibility benefit from darker fin coloration, further study warranted. He could not have known that this small annotation, coupled with the statistical analyses soon underway, would influence camouflage policy across the European theatre. War magnifies mistakes until they acquire consequence. The wrong paint on a tail assembly, shipped in haste from a Midwestern plant, now streaked over Europe at 250 miles an hour amid thunder and flame. The men who built it would never know that gunners credited it for their survival, nor that operations researchers would later use its existence to question the very purpose of camouflage at high altitude. When the debriefs ended that April day, Captain Carter stepped outside into the damp English dusk. The smell of burnt cordite still clung to his flight jacket. Beyond the perimeter track, ground crews were already scrubbing soot from the bullet-pocked skin of their machines. He turned to look at Sweet Laverne, parked under a canvas windbreak. The tail, darker than the rest, merged with the fading sky until only the white star and bar remained visible. "Maybe. Jerry really can't see it," he muttered. Then, quieter, "Whatever it is, let's hope they never fix it." In a war where survival was measured in fractions, one anonymous worker's mistake had begun its silent journey toward legend, an unrecorded line in the great ledger of chance that decided who lived to see another dawn over England. The story of that tale began not in the skies over Bremen, but in a low brick building 2,000 miles from the nearest ocean, in the small Indiana town of Evansville. The factory had been a refrigerator plant before the war. Its workers once assembled compressors and enamel panels for kitchen iceboxes. By 1943, it bore a new name on the gate, Republic Aviation Subcontract Works No. 14. The air smelled of solvent and aluminum dust. The workers were mostly women, many still in their 20s, wearing kerchiefs against the spray mists of paint guns. On a grey March morning, a rail car from the Quartermaster Supply depot arrived with drums of camouflage paint. Each was marked with stenciled letters that blurred from condensation. Olive Drab No. 41. Aircraft use only. In the confusion of unloading, one barrel labelled Medium Green No. 42 was stacked among the rest. To a supply clerk working 12-hour shifts, The difference meant nothing. Both were army shades. Both dried to something dark and dull. He initialed the receiving form without noticing the substitution. The error would have ended there if not for the war's constant demand for haste. The Evansville plant's quota had just been raised again 48 tail assemblies per week for Boeing's B-17 program. Each vertical stabilizer left the line already skinned, primed, and sprayed with camouflage before shipment to final assembly. Any delay meant an idle assembly line 3 states away, and idle lines were unthinkable in 1943. So the paint crew mixed what they had. Spray guns hissed in rhythmic bursts as clouds of fine pigment drifted under the ceiling fans. The new paint looked darker, glossier in the wet light, but it covered well and dried fast. "Must be a fresh batch," one forewoman said, noting how it cured smooth as satin. There was no time to send samples for verification. Each part received 2 coats and a stenciled serial number before being hoisted onto flat cars bound for Seattle. Inside the shipping office, a clerk noticed the discrepancy on a requisition copy MG42 instead of OD41. He hesitated, then shrugged. The difference was surely bureaucratic shorthand. The train was already loaded, engines hissing. He stamped the manifest cleared for shipment, priority 1, and sent it west. Weeks later, those darker tails arrived at Boeing's Plant 2 on the Duwamish River. The production foreman examined one briefly, rubbing the surface with his thumb. The shade was off, yes, but the finish was flawless. Paint irregularities weren't enough to halt output when the Army Air Forces were demanding 300 bombers a month. "They'll be flying too high for anyone to notice," he told his supervisor. "Send them through." By late spring, the green-tailed sections were riveted to fuselages, bearing names that would soon appear on 8th Air Force flight rosters. Sweet Laverne, Ruthless Angel, Big Noise from Kentucky. The difference in color was subtle but unmistakable, a deep forest hue in the center of the vertical fin that contrasted with the standard olive of the fuselage. Officially, the aircraft still met camouflage specifications. Unofficially, they bore a birthmark of human error. The war factories operated like organs in a vast mechanical body, each feeding materials to the next. The average B-17 contained over 350,000 separate parts sourced from more than 1,000 subcontractors. Rivets from Connecticut, glass from Pennsylvania, propellers from Ohio, instruments from New Jersey. A single mislabeled drum among that torrent was invisible, one molecule lost in a river of war. But even molecules matter when magnified by repetition. By the time inspectors in Washington noticed the Evansville deviation in July, at least 150 tail assemblies had already been delivered, installed, and shipped overseas. The internal memo recorded the discovery with bureaucratic understatement. Subcontractor received wrong paint. Once discovered, production demands did not permit repainting. In an office somewhere in right field, an Army Air Forces engineer read the note and underlined that sentence twice. Repainting meant lost time, stripped schedules, missed quotas, and so the matter ended in a file drawer, another anomaly buried beneath thousands of urgent priorities. Yet every bomber carried its own biography of labor and error. The workers who had sprayed that wrong paint never knew where their parts went. They worked through nights, their wages sent to husbands, overseas, or to parents on farms. On breaks they smoked outside, beside rail spurs, lined with crates marked aviation components, fragile. No one in Evansville imagined their handiwork streaking through the flak above Europe, nor that a trivial mix-up could become an invisible shield. When the shift whistle blew at midnight, the young woman assigned to paint inspection, her name lost in the records, known only as line worker, Station 9, walked the row of finished stabilizers with a clipboard. She checked serials, verified drying times, and paused at the final assembly, admiring the deep green gleam under sodium lamps. "Looks good," she told the foreman. He grunted, already thinking of the next day's quota. She signed her initials 2 looping letters no historian would ever trace, and moved on. 2 months later, her work rolled down the runway at Boeing Field, attached to the tail of Sweet Laverne. The serial number matched her checklist. The color difference, that she had thought looked good, would, by chance, become one of the most discussed quirks in the 8th Air Force maintenance logs. In wartime production, errors often died quietly. A wrong resistor, an undersized bolt, a mismatched gasket all could vanish into the enormity of output. But this one would travel across the Atlantic, through convoy and air ferry, into combat squadrons, where statistical analysis measured life and death in decimals. By autumn of 1943, engineers at the 8th Air Force Maintenance Division in England were debating whether to standardize the darker shade, citing reports from crews who claimed it helped conceal the tail from flak predictors. "Could be imagination," one officer wrote, "but we will not ignore any potential advantage." The suggestion went nowhere officially, but the question persisted. And somewhere back in Indiana, the refrigerator plant kept spraying. War contracts ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The paint shop workers received commendations for exceeding targets. None of them ever learned that their uncorrected shipment of medium green number 42 had entered legend proof that even in a war engineered by generals and mathematicians, chance still had a hand in who came home. When the final whistle blew on VJ Day 2 years later, the Evansville factory closed its doors. The paint guns were stored, the women went back to clerking, teaching, and raising families. Only the Air Force archives remembered them in a single typed line about a wrong paint received. Yet across Europe, veterans of the 384th still swore by those green tails, and some would joke, half in earnest, that a nameless factory worker's mistake had kept death's aim just a little off target. The 8th Air Force fought its war not only with courage and steel, but with numbers. Every mission was a column of arithmetic airspeed, altitude, time on target, bomb load, and fuel burn, all reduced to figures on a clipboard. Yet beneath those equations lay an older, blunter truth. The difference between life and death often came down to visibility. Could the enemy see you long enough to aim? By the spring of 1943, the Germans had perfected the art of killing bombers they could not even see. Their flak guns, 88s, 105s, and the monstrous 128s ringing the Ruhr no longer fired blindly. Each battery operated as part of a network guided by radar and mathematics. On the coast, the Freya early warning radar picked up bomber streams hundreds of miles out. As they crossed into the range of Würzburg tracking stations, the guns locked on through triangulated data fed into mechanical computers called Kommandogeräte. Those devices predicted the bomber's position seconds into the future, setting the fuses automatically. When the shells exploded, they were not guessing, they were waiting. To defeat that system, the Americans turned to their own mathematicians. In the cold rooms of Bomber Command Headquarters at High Wycombe, operations research officers analyzed everything. Loss percentages by altitude, formation spacing, even paint reflectivity. They pored over gun camera film, flak damage surveys, and reconnaissance photographs searching for patterns invisible to intuition. The results were often chillingly precise. A report dated June 21, 1943, concluded that a fortress at 25,000 feet faced a mean probability of destruction of 1.7% per mission from flak alone. Multiply that by the 25 missions required for rotation, and the odds of a crew surviving its tour dropped below 50%. The only way to change that equation was to alter the variables, the altitude, the timing, the speed, or, somehow, the enemy's ability to aim. Camouflage had begun the war as a ground-based concern. Olive drab and neutral grey were chosen to hide aircraft parked on English airfields from Luftwaffe reconnaissance, not to deceive radar. At 30,000 feet, a coat of paint could not hide a 4-engine bomber from a Würzburg scope. Yet crews continued to believe in colour as a kind of talisman, an echo of the pre-war age when dogfights were still fought by eyesight. The subtle variations of shade sun-faded panels, replacement parts, or the darker tails from Evansville became talking points in ready rooms. In June, an observer from the U.S. Army Air Force's Operations Analysis Section visited the 384th Bomb Group to collect crew impressions. Among the notes he filed was an offhand comment. Several crews report darker tail assemblies less visible under haze, cannot confirm objectively. It was a bureaucrat's way of saying, "We noticed, but we don't yet believe." At the same time, a parallel revolution was unfolding in electronic warfare. British scientists had recently introduced window, thin strips of aluminum foil dropped from bombers to confuse radar. The Americans called it chaff. Trials showed that when clouds of foil filled the sky, Würzburg screens bloomed with false echoes, breaking the mathematical link between radar and flak predictor. The first mass use over Hamburg in July reduced flak accuracy by nearly 75%. Suddenly, visibility was no longer a simple question of eyes and paint. It was a contest between machines, between electromagnetic waves and countermeasures, between prediction and deception. The darker-tailed fortresses of the 384th entered combat just as that transformation began. Their accidental color shift, invisible to radar but unpredictable to human gunners, played into the same equation. Uncertainty equals survival. Flak officers on the ground learned to fire by mixed methods. Radar provided the grid, binoculars refined the aim. In that last stage, when a human gunner looked through a rangefinder at high, sun-glittering aircraft, the color and contrast still mattered. If the tail merged with the background a half-second earlier, if the shape dissolved into haze before the final correction, the shell would burst 50 yards too far, or too soon. In a sky full of bursting steel, 50 yards could mean the difference between a clean fuselage and a coffin of twisted aluminum. At High Wycombe, Colonel Charles Lovelace, one of the American analysts seconded to the British, began tabulating new kinds of data: near-miss density, burst deviation, and relative concentration of black puffs per target. The numbers revealed something strange. Among comparable bomb groups, the 384th showed slightly lower flak hit ratios per sortie, even though its mission profiles were no safer. The difference was minute, perhaps 1 hit in 100 fewer, but when multiplied across hundreds of missions, it meant dozens of fortresses, returning that might otherwise have fallen. Lovelace did not know about Evansville's paint error. His charts showed only results. In a marginal note beside one column he scribbled, "Possibly variance in visibility characteristics." That line too would vanish into the archives, unread for decades. Meanwhile, the crews kept flying through the mathematics. Over Münster, Schweinfurt, Regensburg, they learned that survival was an accumulation of tiny advantages: a better engine tune, a tighter formation, a lucky cloud bank. The dark-tailed ships became symbols of that luck. Pilots asked for them by serial number when assignments were drawn. Crew chiefs touched their fins for luck before takeoff. In the world of numbers, superstition was another form of logic, the human attempt to personalize probability. Every man in the 8th Air Force knew the arithmetic of his own life expectancy. Faith in a shade of paint was as rational as faith in armor plate or prayer. By autumn, the data analysts were noticing a trend beyond any single color. Camouflage itself was losing its purpose. Reconnaissance photos showed that at high altitude, olive drab faded to pale gray after a few months of exposure, nearly indistinguishable from bare aluminum. Moreover, the paint added several hundred pounds to each bomber weight that could have been fuel or altitude. Engineers at Wright Field calculated that stripping paint from a B-17 increased its service ceiling by 300 feet and its top speed by nearly 5 miles per hour. Against radar-guided flak, those gains mattered more than color. And yet, as the first unpainted bombers began arriving in late 1943, many crews still felt uneasy. The dull, silvery surfaces looked naked, unprotected. "They shine like coins in the sun," one gunner complained. But the statisticians were firm. Reflections at 25,000 feet did not kill bombers, shell bursts did. The darker tails, born from one worker's mix-up, had quietly anticipated this shift. They proved accidentally that irregularity could confuse the enemy as effectively as camouflage. The lesson would spread through maintenance depots and design bureaus. Perfection was not always protection. Somewhere in a warehouse back in the States, another shipment of medium green paint sat unopened, its error long corrected on paper. Yet the arithmetic of war had already absorbed the mistake. On mission charts across England, where each black square represented a lost plane, the columns for the 384th filled more slowly than expected. No one could prove why. But in the tallies of survival, the cold mathematics that governed life in the flak-filled skies, a single misplaced barrel of paint had already begun to make itself felt. By the winter of 1943, the 384th Bomb Group's reputation for uncanny survivability had become part of 8th Air Force folklore. Crews at Grafton Underwood joked that the men of the Green Tail outfit carried the best charm in Europe. When replacements arrived fresh from the States, wide-eyed and nervous, veterans whispered, "Stick near the darker ones, you'll come back." Nobody could prove it, yet the belief ran deep. After every raid, mechanics counted flak holes and patched the jagged edges with fresh aluminum. Again and again, the fortresses with the shadowed tails came home a little less wounded. Their battle damage charts showed fewer punctures around the rudder and elevators, the very areas most exposed to ground fire. Even the statistics officer, Lieutenant Ben Harker, a man allergic to superstition, finally admitted that the pattern merits attention. He wrote to 8 Bomber Command's Analysis Division, requesting comparison data. Weeks later, he received a thin envelope marked confidential. Inside were 2 typed pages and a hand-drawn chart. The note accompanying it read simply, "Minor, correlation noted between surface contrast and apparent flak accuracy. Recommend no action pending further evidence." The bureaucracy had seen what he saw, but even in a war built on data, no one wanted to credit luck. In January 1944, a visiting engineer from Wright Field toured the base. His name was Major Lawrence Boyd, an aeronautical specialist studying paint degradation. During his inspection, he paused beside Sweet Laverne and ran his hand across the darker panel. "That's not standard OD," he murmured. The crew chief shrugged. "Been that way since she got here. Paint shop says it came from the factory." Boyd nodded, scribbled something in his notebook, and moved on. His later report, buried among hundreds of technical memos, contained one sentence that almost explained everything: medium green no. 42 appears to absorb light spectrum frequencies less visible under European atmospheric haze. The crews didn't need spectral analysis, they Texas trusted their eyes. Over Germany, the sky was seldom clear. Industrial smoke and contrails formed veils that turned sunlit altitudes into milky grey tunnels. The darker tails simply disappeared sooner into that haze. Gunners on the ground had seconds to sight, lead, and fire. A half-second lost in contrast could mean a clean miss. It became habit to seek out those planes for morale, if nothing else. "If I had to go up again," waist gunner Tom Murray told an interviewer years later, "I'd want that tail in front of me." The flak burst behind it, not on it. By spring, the official colour debate reached the camouflage boards in Washington. Reports from England argued for unpainted aluminum finishes to save weight, but several field officers warned that duller or darker surfaces might still yield marginal benefits under certain weather conditions. No one mentioned Evansville by name, yet the memory of those dark-tailed fortresses lingered in the conversation. In April 1944, orders came down authorizing experimental countershading schemes on test aircraft. The memo referenced preliminary field observations without attribution. Somewhere between the lines, a single worker's accidental barrel of paint had inspired a new chapter in aerial visibility research. Meanwhile, the war moved on. The 384th joined the great bomber streams over Berlin, Schweinfurt, and Merseburg. The green tails kept flying until attrition and rotation replaced every airframe. Sweet Laverne herself was lost in August over France when flak set her no, 3-engine ablaze. Her crew bailed out and survived. The wreckage was found months later, her tail still faintly darker than the rest, half buried in a Normandy hedgerow. After the war, few remembered the anomaly. The Evansville plant returned to making refrigerators. The workers never knew that one mislabeled drum of medium green paint had traveled across oceans and through hellfire. Only, in the quiet language of statistics, did its ghost remain a fractional deviation, a barely measurable improvement in survival odds that hinted at something larger. Historians would later call it coincidence, but the veterans called it luck. They remembered how the darker fins seemed to vanish when the sun was low, how the flak that found everyone else somehow missed them. In a war of factories and mathematics, perhaps luck was simply what happened when error met opportunity. Years later, at a reunion in Dayton, Ohio, a group of grey-haired airmen from the 384th posed for a photograph beside a restored B-17. The aircraft gleamed in polished aluminum, bright and flawless. As they dispersed, one man lingered by the tail and said softly, "Ours never looked like this. Ours were darker, just enough to fool death." No plaque marks the Evansville factory. No medal was struck for the worker who sprayed the wrong paint. But among those who once watched flak, flowers bloom around them at 25,000 feet. The legend endures, the wrong color that made it home. After the war ended, Europe's skies emptied of contrails. The airfields of East Anglia, once thunderous with fortresses, fell silent. Grass grew between the runways, and the control towers stood like monuments to arithmetic, each brick laid for the fractions of men who had returned. But in offices thousands of miles away, the war's numbers were still alive. At Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, the Air Force's Statistical Control Division began the grim work of turning chaos into order. Loss rates, sortie counts, bomb tonnage, all were tabulated into columns of meaning. Among the endless sheets of paper lay a small, persistent irregularity. When analysts cross-compared unit records against expected attrition models, one group kept defying probability. The 384th Bomb Group, active from May 1943 to April 1945, had recorded a flak loss rate almost 12% lower than its regional mean. The analysts double-checked, suspecting data error. They recalculated using mission logs, then adjusted for altitude, bomb load, and target zone density. The anomaly remained. It was small, statistically significant, but narratively invisible, the kind of mystery that made mathematicians restless. One young analyst, Captain Richard Hanley, asked for permission to investigate further. Hanley had flown 25 missions himself before being reassigned to the numbers war. He understood that behind every digit was a name, a crew, a story. In March 1946, he drafted a memorandum titled Unusual Visibility Data in the 384th Bombardment Group. Hanley's analysis was meticulous. He compared sortie conditions, gun camera reports, and even cloud cover indices recorded by meteorological flights. Still, no conventional variable could explain the disparity. Then, buried in the maintenance appendices, he noticed an insero in place. Entry repeated across early aircraft serials. Vertical Stabilizer Assembly, Subcontractor Code, EV14. The initials meant nothing at first. He pulled production manifests from the Air Materiel Command archives and followed the trail through shipping records to the Republic Aviation Subcontract Works No. 14, Evansville, Indiana. The paint specification listed for that batch medium green No. 42 did not match standard olive drab No. 41. Hanley requested colorimetric data from the wartime camouflage board. The difference was subtle but measurable. Medium green absorbed light in a narrower band of the visible spectrum, reducing contrast under atmospheric scattering by roughly 6%. 6% barely enough to register to the human eye, yet more than enough to shift flak aim when multiplied by thousands of guns and miles of haze. The realization came quietly. He did not imagine it heroic, only logical. A worker somewhere had opened the wrong barrel, and that error had nudged the probabilities. It had saved, by his rough estimate, between 300 and 500 airmen, enough to fill an entire bomb group. Hanley submitted his report to his superior, Colonel Lovelace, now head of Statistical Review. Lovelace skimmed the findings, smiled faintly, and wrote one line across the cover page. Confirmed, but not actionable. Outcome accidental. File under camouflage, miscellaneous. And so the discovery joined the other curiosities of war, forgotten not because it lacked truth, but because it lacked glamour. The Air Force of 1947 wanted jets, not ghost stories of paint. The files were boxed, labelled, and shelved in Record Group 237 at the National Archives. But the story refused to die. In 1962, during a symposium on wartime aviation design, a retired Boeing engineer recalled the Evansville tales while discussing production irregularities. His offhand comment sparked laughter from the audience, yet one journalist in attendance took note. Months later, Aviation Review published an article titled "The Wrong Paint That Worked." Veterans of the 8th Air Force recognized the phrase immediately. Letters poured in, pilots and gunners writing from every state, each insisting they remembered the green tails, each certain they had meant something. By the time of the 1985 Pacific and European Veterans Reunion in Hawaii, the anecdote had matured into legend. Some claimed the color-confused radar, others swore it was invisible to German optics. The truth, as always, lived between myth and mathematics. Historians rediscovered Hanley's report decades later while digitizing declassified archives. His tone was clinical, but one sentence in his conclusion stood out. Statistical variance may stem from human error in material supply. If so, it demonstrates that even mistakes can serve as camouflage against fate. In the museum displays and documentaries that followed, the story was retold 100 ways, sometimes as fate, sometimes as irony. But among those who had flown, the meaning was simpler. War was a machine made of chance. Every rivet, every cloud, every flicker of sunlight carried consequence. And somewhere in Evansville, in a forgotten brick building that once hummed with compressors and spray guns, a worker, her name long vanished from the records, had unknowingly signed her initials beneath a line that read, "Paint Lot, MG 42. Her hand had steadied the hose, the mist had drifted into the air, and history had shifted, not with a roar but with the quiet hiss of a spray gun in a factory that never knew what it had done. In the years after the war, the story of the green tails faded into the background hum of history, one rumor among thousands of anecdotes that filled veterans' reunions, memoirs, and late-night recollections over bourbon. The world was moving forward. Jet engines had replaced propellers, radar had replaced eyesight, and nuclear deterrence had replaced daylight bombing. Yet deep inside the new United States Air Force, a few quiet thinkers still studied the old data, searching for meaning in the millions of figures that had defined victory. By 1951, the Air Force had established a branch at the RAND Corporation dedicated to combat survivability. Among its early analysts was a civilian mathematician named Margaret Howell, one of the few women in the division and one of the fewer who had lived through the war as a factory worker herself. She was 20 during her time at Douglas Aircraft's Long Beach plant, and she still remembered the smell of lacquer and the endless rush of quotas. One afternoon, while reviewing declassified wartime data on aircraft visibility, she came across Hanley's old memorandum from 1946, the unusual visibility data in the 384th Bombardment Group. It was misfiled in a batch of unrelated reports about aluminum fatigue. She began reading it during lunch and found herself unable to stop. The math was primitive by RAND standards, but the logic struck her as profound. A random, unintentional manufacturing error had produced a statistically significant change in combat survival. In an internal note, Howell wrote to her supervisor, "If minor color deviation could alter visibility probability by measurable percentages, deliberate modulation, non-uniform painting, surface variance, random reflectivity might yield greater benefit than uniform camouflage. Nature hides through irregularity. Industry hides through repetition. Perhaps we should reverse that." Her supervisor, an ex-bomber officer named Colonel Norman Duke, was intrigued enough to authorize a small study. The project-coded RAND memo RM6247, Variable Surface Reflectance in Combat Environments, tested Howell's hypothesis using scaled models photographed under simulated haze. The results confirmed what the skies over Europe had already proven by accident. Surfaces with subtle irregular contrasts broke up visual recognition faster than those painted in consistent tones. The study circulated quietly through the Air Research and Development Command. A decade later, when aerospace firms began exploring radar-absorbent coatings for reconnaissance aircraft, Howell's memo resurfaced in internal bibliographies. Though her name never appeared on the patents, one engineer at Lockheed's Skunk Works would later remark that the principle behind their stealth experiments owed something to a forgotten war story about bomber tails and a wrong shade of green. Meanwhile, in Evansville, Indiana, the old Republic Aviation Subcontract Works No. 14 stood derelict. The war contracts had ended, the rail spurs rusted over, and the factory's windows were boarded up. In 1963, a local newspaper ran a nostalgia piece titled "The Plant That Helped Win the War." Among the grainy photographs was one of a young woman in a kerchief inspecting a vertical stabilizer. Her name, written in pencil on the back, was E. Miller. No one knew what became of her. By then, the Air Force had formally acknowledged that camouflage, in its pre-war sense, no longer mattered in the jet age. The polished aluminum of the Korean War gave way to greys and blues optimized for high-altitude lighting. Yet the research lineage from that single wartime era persisted in subtle ways, in the matte coatings of reconnaissance planes, the irregular composite panels of later bombers, and eventually, the faceted skin of the F-117 stealth aircraft that would first fly in the 1970s. In 1984, a historian named Dr. Daniel Lang of the Air Force Historical Research Agency stumbled across Hanley's Green Tail file while compiling a monograph on World War II industrial production. He tracked down surviving members of the 384th Bomb Group and recorded their recollections. The interviews revealed something the data never could: belief. Every man remembered the color. Some called it forest green, others almost black. They remembered how the tail seemed to blur against the overcast, how it melted into the mist. But more than that, they remembered the feeling, the quiet superstition that perhaps, by some grace of factory oversight, they had been given an advantage that no general could issue and no enemy could see. Lang's resulting article, published in the Air Power History Quarterly under the title "The Shade of Survival," revived interest in the subject. He quoted one gunner who said, "When you're flying into flak so thick you could walk on it, you'll take any miracle you can get. Ours just happened to be painted on." The story found its way into classrooms at the Air Force Academy, where instructors used it to illustrate the chaos factor in military planning, the idea that in the complex systems, even random events can produce disproportionate outcomes. A few cadets began calling it the Evansville effect, shorthand for the unpredictable intersection of human error and human salvation. By the 1990s, digital imaging had replaced the old wartime charts. Analysts could simulate visibility and reflectance across entire spectrums of light. In a 1992 technical paper on optical signature management, one author cited Howell's 1951 RAND study and Hanley's 1946 memorandum by number, remarking that the earliest empirical observation of surface contrast irregularity, improving survival probability, occurred accidentally in World War II, B-17 operations. The footnote was small, but the lineage was undeniable. No one remembered the clerk who signed the wrong invoice or the forewoman who approved the paint mix, but their fingerprints stretched across half a century of aviation progress. In the Air Force Museum at Dayton, Ohio, just a few miles from where Hanley had typed his report, stands a restored B-17G, its skin polished to a mirror sheen. Visitors walk past it without noticing the display case nearby. Inside lies a single vertical stabilizer panel, painted a dark, matte green. The placard reads, "Tail Assembly, Boeing B-17F 384th Bomb Group. Manufactured 1943, Evansville, Indiana. Paint specification discrepancy resulted in unique color variant. Field reports associated with improved survivability. Artifact donated by former maintenance personnel, 1947. No mention of heroism, no mention of fate. Just a few sterile lines summarizing one of history's smallest miracles. But every year, during the veterans' gathering in the museum's atrium, the old men stop before that panel. They rest their hands on the cold metal, look at the dull green that once shimmered against the haze of flak-torn skies, and smile the kind of smile only men who have survived impossible odds can wear. In their silence lingers a truth that no equation could capture, that sometimes history turns not on genius or design, but on the color of a mistake. For decades, the story of the Evansville tale had existed only as an echo, a passing mention in debriefs, a curiosity in engineering memos, a superstition among men who had flown through storms of iron. But in the late 1990s, the National Archives began digitizing millions of pages of World War II industrial documents. Among the faded requisitions, invoices, and correspondence, one particular file caught the attention of an archivist named Helen Sutter. It was a thin folder from Republic Aviation Subcontract Works No. 14, dated March 9, 1943. Inside was a stack of routine forms, quality control checklists, daily production tallies, and one hand-signed inspection log from Line Station 9. At the bottom of the page, just above the printed words "Paint Approved," serials 1463-1478 cleared, were two initials written in blue, pencil E.M. Sutter remembered the story of the wrong paint she had heard years earlier at a veterans symposium. The initials matched the name scribbled on the back of that old newspaper photograph, E. Miller. Her curiosity flared. The bureaucratic trail that Captain Hanley had traced half a century earlier had ended with a nameless worker. Now, that worker had a name, and perhaps a story. She began searching census and employment records from wartime Indiana. Within weeks, she found her. Eleanor May Miller, born 1923 in Posey County, Indiana. Employed at Republic's Evansville subcontractor plant from February 1943 to August 1945. After the war, she had married a machinist, raised 3 children, and died in 1978. Her obituary in the Evansville Courier made no mention of airplanes, only that she worked during the war years at the defense factory. Sutter felt the weight of it, how ordinary, the extraordinary always seemed in hindsight. Here was a woman who had never known she had altered the fate of hundreds. Her mistake, the wrong barrel, the darker shade, had passed through her hands as just another night's work. Determined to confirm the link, Sutter visited the old factory site. It stood half-collapsed by then, overgrown with ivy, its loading bay doors hanging like open mouths. Inside, the floor was dusted with decades of paint flakes, the walls lined with ghost outlines where machines had once stood. She found a brass tag embedded in concrete near the north wall. Line 9, Paint Station. The same code printed on the form she had held. That discovery inspired a short essay for the Journal of Industrial History titled "The Woman with the Clipboard." Sutter reconstructed Eleanor Miller's world, the endless quotas, the shifts that blurred into exhaustion, the smell of solvent and aluminum. She described how, in one unnoticed moment, Eleanor had approved a colour she thought was a bit dark but within tolerance. And that simple judgment, signed without a second thought, rippled outward into the skies of Europe. The article gained modest attention, mostly among historians of technology. But among airmen's circles, it hit with unexpected force. Former members of the 384th Bomb Group, now in their 70s and 80s, began writing to Sutter. "She saved my crew," one man wrote from Ohio. Another sent a photo of himself beside a B-17, adding, "If you find her family, tell them thank you." Moved by the responses, Sutter tracked down Eleanor's daughter, a retired schoolteacher living near Terre Haute. When she told her what she had found, the woman went quiet for a long time before saying softly, "Mum used to say she just did what she was told and prayed the paint would dry before morning." In May 2001, the Air Force Museum invited Eleanor Miller's family to a small ceremony in Dayton. It was not a medal presentation, there was no official citation for accidental contribution. It was something humbler and perhaps more fitting. Beneath the preserved tail panel from Evansville, they placed a brass plate engraved with her name and the words, Eleanor M.M. Miller, line worker, Station 9 Republic Aviation, subcontract, works no. 14 whose hands left a mark upon history during the dedication, a retired colonel from the 384th, addressed the small crowd. His voice trembled but carried the calm certainty of memory. "We used to talk about luck," he said, "about the men who made it home when others didn't. Turns out luck has fingerprints. Sometimes it smells like solvent and wears a factory apron." After the ceremony, visitors approached Eleanor's daughter, asking for autographs, shaking her hand. She seemed overwhelmed. "Mom never flew," she told them. She was afraid of heights, but she'd be proud to know she'd helped someone land safely. The museum display became a quiet pilgrimage site. Veterans left unit patches and photographs beneath the green panel. Students came through on tours, hearing the story of how one woman's routine task, misreading a paint label during the most mechanized war in history, had proven that humanity could still outwit the cold logic of destruction. In time, the green tail story transcended its military origins. It entered books on complexity theory, psychology, even philosophy. Scholars cited it as evidence of the butterfly effect, long before the term became popular, a reminder that in vast systems, the smallest errors can yield the largest mercies. When the last living B-17 pilot of the 384th passed away in 2014, the eulogy mentioned Eleanor Miller by name. "We owe her nothing less than the sky," the chaplain read aloud. Today, visitors who stand before that relic in Dayton rarely notice the fine difference in color. But under museum lights, when the reflection shifts just so, the surface seems to darken, absorbing the light the way it once absorbed the sightlines of German flak gunners half a world away. That shade, a quiet, imperfect green, remains what it always was, the color of luck, of error, of life stolen back from the mathematics of war. The color of a clipboard checkmark that saved 1,000 men who would never know her name. In the spring of 2023, 80 years after Eleanor Miller rolled her last stroke of that imperfect green, the Evansville Museum held an anniversary exhibit titled Makers of the Sky. Among the gleaming aluminum cowls, blueprints, and assembly line photographs, one display drew the longest line, a square of faded vertical stabilizer painted in medium green 42. Visitors rarely grasped what they were looking at. To them, it was just paint and obsolete pigment on tired aluminum. But to those who understood, it was something closer to a relic, a quiet reminder that the smallest imprecision could tilt the arc of history. The exhibit's curator, Dr. Alan Fenwick, had spent years tracing the legacy of that color. With modern spectrography, he confirmed the deviation, a pigment formula rich in chromium oxide and slightly carbon-heavy, giving it a denser absorption band in the red spectrum. Under the haze light conditions of northern Europe, it reflected almost identically to sky grey above 20,000 feet, meaning the tail blended with the horizon more effectively than standard olive drab. It wasn't magic, Fenwick told journalists. It was physics, born of a paperwork mistake. In his presentation, Fenwick showed how the same principles now guided the design of modern aircraft coatings, from radar-absorbing composites to optical disruption paint schemes used on stealth drones. The lineage from that wrong paint barrel to the invisible aircraft of the passers. 21st century was, he said, an unbroken thread of accident leading to mastery. Yet beyond the laboratories and archives, the story had found a gentler audience. In classrooms across the Midwest, teachers told their students about the woman in the factory who had saved men she never met, They spoke of chance, of responsibility, of how every small action mattered. "You never know who you're saving," one school poster read, above a photograph of Eleanor's paint-splattered clipboard. Back in Evansville, the old Republic plant had been demolished. In its place stood a low concrete building, an auto parts warehouse. But during the exhibit's final week, a group of local volunteers placed a bronze marker on the roadside verge. On this site, in 1943, workers of Republic Aviation Subcontract Works No. 14 produced aircraft parts for the B-17 Flying Fortress. One unrecorded mistake in paint specification contributed to improved survival for aircrews of the 384th Bomb Group, proof that even imperfection can serve a perfect cause. The dedication drew few reporters, but among those attending were grandchildren of both sides, descendants of the American flyers, and of the German radar officers who once tracked them through the haze. One elderly man, the son of a former Luftwaffe flak gunner, approached the marker after the speeches. In accented English, he murmured, "If she painted it darker, maybe my father fired higher." Then, almost reverently, he placed a small bouquet of white carnations at the base. Meanwhile, in Dayton, the archivists preparing for a new digital exhibit uncovered one more file. It was a carbon copy of a letter from 1948, sent from Captain Richard Hanley to the Air Materiel Command before his discharge. In it he wrote, "I've often thought about the men I knew in the 384th, and about that peculiar statistic. I suppose we'll never find the worker who made the error, but maybe that's the point. Wars are fought by millions, and sometimes won by one unseen hand." Hanley died in 1974, unaware that his memo would eventually become the cornerstone of the Evansville effect. His original typewritten report, yellowed and brittle, was placed beside Eleanor's paint panel in the museum's permanent collection. Two ordinary artifacts, a stack of paper, and a metal fin telling a story far larger than themselves. On the 80th anniversary of the Evansville plant's founding, the Air Force Heritage Foundation produced a short film titled "The Shade Between Life and Death." It opened with archival footage, women spraying primer, B-17s roaring off from misty English fields, and crews laughing beside the planes with the darker tails. The narrator's voice was calm, almost elegiac. In a war measured by tons and miles and megawatts, one misplaced barrel of paint changed the math of survival. No medals were given, no names, and recorded, but in the quiet arithmetic of chance, a single human error became an act of mercy. The film ended with color footage of modern aircraft F-35 seconds and stealth drones lifting into twilight skies painted in the same muted green-grey tone, a hue deliberately chosen to echo that accidental legacy. At the film's closing event, Eleanor Miller's granddaughter, a chemical engineer, spoke briefly to the gathered veterans and engineers. "I sometimes think about my grandmother at that paint station," she said. "Tired, overworked, just doing her job. Maybe she worried she'd done something wrong. Maybe she thought no one would notice. But they did. 80 years later, we're still painting in her color." As the audience stood in applause, she stepped down from the podium and touched the tail panel on display. The surface was cool under her palm, rough from age, but it still caught the light in that peculiar way, neither olive nor grey, but something quietly in between. Outside, the sky above Dayton deepened toward evening. The last sunlight slanted through thin clouds, tinting them in a faint greenish glow that only the most attentive eyes could see. Somewhere in that light, invisible but enduring, lived the memory of a factory mistake that had outlived bombers, factories, even the war itself. The color had become something eternal, the proof that in the machinery of war, salvation could be hidden in the brushstroke of an ordinary hand.